Why avoidants miss the anxious EX they once rejected. Let's be real, breakups hurt. But what no one talks about is what happens months later when the person who pulled away starts to miss you. I'm talking about that avoidant ex, the one who seems so detached, so hard to reach, and who, despite everything, pushed you away even when all you gave was love. And now they're texting, watching your stories, maybe even saying they miss you. Why? Because avoidants aren't cold, they're conflicted. They crave intimacy, but fear what it might cost them. So when someone like you, an anxious type, someone emotionally tuned in, someone who actually shows up, comes into their life, it stirs something deep. But here's the trap: your presence feels like pressure to them. Not because of what you're doing wrong, but because they haven't yet learned how to stay safe in closeness. So they do what they always dog, they run. And yet, after you leave, something happens. In the silence, they remember. They remember how you sensed when something was off, how you reached for their hand when they couldn't ask, how your affection was consistent, even when they pulled away. Because love like that doesn't come often. And when it's gone, it leaves a gap. Not just in their schedule, but in their heart. They don't miss being chased. They miss the depth, the warmth, the way your love held a mirror up to the parts of themselves they couldn't yet face. Here's the twisting: the more you grow, the more attractive you become, not just to them, but to yourself. And ironically, that's when they really start to miss you. But your job isn't to shrink back, it's to stay expanded. If they couldn't handle the real you before, they don't get a version of you now that had to suffer to become this strong. So yes, avoidants miss the anxious ex they once rejected, but what they really miss is the safety they felt but couldn't receive. And by the time they realize it, you're already becoming someone who doesn't chase it because you finally know your worth. Avoidant individuals often get labeled as cold, distant, or heartless, but the truth is far more complex. They're not immune to connection. In fact, many of them crave it just as deeply as anyone else. What sets them apart is their relationship to emotional closeness. For an avoidant, intimacy doesn't feel safe. It feels like a risk to their autonomy, a potential threat to their emotional control. So when someone comes into their life offering deep, genuine connection, like an anxiously attached partner, it can feel both intoxicating and overwhelming. At first, they might be drawn to the energy, the warmth, the attentiveness. It's magnetic, but that same emotional intensity can quickly start to feel like pressure. It triggers fears of being engulfed, of losing their independence, of not being able to meet expectations. And because they've likely never learned how to feel secure in emotional vulnerability, they instinctively start to withdraw. It's not calculated, it's protective. They might tell themselves that the relationship is moving too fast, or that something just doesn't feel right. But more often than not, what they're really feeling is fear masked as detachment. Just get a reply. The avoidant doesn't reject connection because they don't want it. They reject it because they don't know how to hold it without feeling overwhelmed. And when that anxious partner begins reaching out more, asking for closeness, trying to talk through the disconnection, it only intensifies the internal panic. So they push away. They create distance. And they might even end things abruptly, telling themselves they're better off alone, or that the relationship just wasn't the right fit. But underneath all of that avoidance is a deeply wired human needing, the desire to be seen, to be understood, to be loved for who they are. It's just buried beneath years of self-protection. That's why after the breakup, when the emotional pressure is gone and space has been created, avoidants often start to reflect. In the quiet, without the immediate fear of emotional closeness, they can finally access the truth of what they lost. They remember how it felt to be cared for, to be wanted, to have someone emotionally attuned to them in a way they couldn't even be to themselves. The love they once ran from becomes the very thing they long for, not because they've suddenly changed, but because the threat is gone. And all that remains is the echo of what that connection gave them. Anxiously attached partners are often misunderstood. They're seen as needy, overly emotional, or too intense. But in reality, they bring something to relationships that is rare and profoundly valuable: emotional nourishment. This kind of partner doesn't just love on the surface, they love deeply, attentively, and with a level of emotional investment that can be transformative. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of consistent emotional presence can feel like both a gift and a challenge. Avoidants often grow up without safe models of closeness. Maybe they were taught that vulnerability was weakness, or that depending on someone would lead to disappointment. So, when they meet someone who not only welcomes emotional depth, but thrives in it, it touches something raw in them. It's unfamiliar, almost alien. And even though part of them may feel drawn to it, another part instinctively resists. But make no mistake, the nourishment is felt. The anxious partner may overcommunicate, may worry too much, may reach out more than seems comfortable. But they also bring empathy, understanding, and emotional attentiveness that few others do. This nourishment doesn't just come from how much they care, but how deeply they tune in. An anxious partner often notices the little shifts in mood, the unspoken signals, the emotional undercurrents that others ignore. They want to understand, to connect, to reassure. And for the avoidant, who may never had someone care so closely or check in so genuinely, that attention can feel almost overwhelming. It pulls them toward intimacy in ways they're not prepared to handle. So they start to pull away, not because the care isn't good, but because it's too good. It touches their emotional blind spots. And here's the irony: when the anxious partner is finally gone, when they've pulled back or walked away for their own sanity, the avoidant begins to notice the loss of that nourishment, not just the physical presence, but the emotional attunement, the way that person knew what they needed before they said it, the way they offered comfort without being asked. That's not something easily replaced. It's something most casual relationships provide. It leaves a gap that lingers. They may not had the tools to receive that love before, but the absence of it highlights just how powerful it really was. The avoidant doesn't necessarily realize they missed emotional nourishment. They just know something felt safer, warmer, more human when you were around. And by the time they see it clearly, the person who gave it so freely may already be gone. When someone gets rejected, especially by an avoidant partner, it's easy to take it personally. The mind races to find reasons. Was I too much? Did I say something wrong? Was I not enough? But what's often overlooked is that rejection in these dynamics is rarely about the anxious partner's worth. It's about the avoidance capacity. There's a big difference between someone walking away because you failed and someone walking away because they couldn't handle what was offered. Avoidantly attached individuals operate with a limited emotional bandwidth. Their nervous systems are wired to perceive intimacy as something threatening. Getting close to someone isn't just romantic or exciting, it's destabilizing. So when an anxious partner comes in with openness, emotional availability, and the desire to bond deeply, it pushes on all the avoidance internal alarm systems. Not because anything bad is actually happening, but because closeness awakens fear. The fear of losing themselves, the fear of being seen, the fear of being vulnerable and not knowing what to do with it. In that space, the anxious partner might be bending over backward to connect, to reassure, to prove they're safe. But instead of bringing the avoidant closer, it makes them feel more trapped. It creates pressure they don't have the tools to manage. That's when they begin to pull away, not of logic or even genuine dislike, but out of emotional overwhelm. They start to interpret love as obligation, connection as danger, and presence as intrusion. And to protect themselves from those feelings, they disconnect. To the anxious partner, that feels like rejection, and in a literal sense, it is. But on an emotional level, what's really happening is that the avoidant is reaching the limit of their emotional window. It's like offering someone a feast when they've only ever known how to survive on crumbs. They panic, not because the feast isn't good, but because they don't know how to digest it. That's why it's so important to understand that this kind of rejection says more about where you are in their own emotional journey than about who you are as a person. You didn't get left because you loved too much. You got left because they didn't know how to receive love without fear. And that distinction is everything. It shifts the narrative from, I wasn't enough, to, they weren't ready. And sometimes knowing that difference is the first step in healing what their rejection made you question about yourself. When an avoidant partner distances themselves or ends a relationship, it can feel like they've closed the door and walked away without a second thought. From the outside, it may look like they've detached cleanly and completely, barely missing a beat. But the truth is far more layered. Distance doesn't erase memories for avoidance. It actually gives them room to surface. Time and space don't always bring clarity right away, but for someone who struggles with closeness, they often amplify what was once too overwhelming to process in the moment. Avoidants are emotionally overwhelmed by intimacy in real time, but that doesn't mean they aren't impacted by it. They often need distance to feel safe enough to reflect. When they're in the relationship, they're busy trying to manage their fear of being consumed, of losing themselves, of being exposed. Just get a reply. They're so preoccupied with protecting their independence and managing their internal discomfort that they don't fully experience the value of what they have. But once space is created, when the pressure is gone and they can breathe again, that's when memory starts to play a different role. Suddenly, they're not in fight or flight mode anymore. They can think back to the little things. The way you looked at them when you were listening. The way you instinctively knew when something was wrong. The way you made them feel seen, even if they didn't show it at the time. Those moments, which were once pushed aside in the name of emotional self-preservation, begin to replay in their mind, this time without the panic. And now they feel different. They feel comforting, even nostalgic. This is often why avoidants begin to circle back months after the relationship has ended, not because they've suddenly become emotionally secure, but because the emotional noise has quieted down enough for them to miss what they couldn't handle before. The space they created to feel safe becomes the very thing that allows them to recognize the depth they lost. And that recognition doesn't come with dramatic fanfare. It arrives slowly, sometimes even subconsciously. A center song, a location, a random moment in their day, and suddenly they're right back in the middle of a memory with you. So while the anxious partner may be grieving loudly and openly in the beginning, the avoidance grief is more like a delayed echo. It hits when the connection is no longer available, when it's safe to feel what was once too threatening. And then, by then, the longing often arrives without a solution, because what they miss, they once rejected. Something powerful happens when the anxious partner begins to heal. At first, the pain of the rejection can feel consuming. There's a deep desire to understand, to fix, to somehow make the avoidant see what they've lost. But over time, when that effort turns inward, when the anxious person starts to prioritize their own peace, boundaries, and emotional regulation, something shifts. They begin to develop self-security. And this is the moment when everything changes, not just for them, but for the dynamic as a whole. Anxious attachment thrives on external validation. It feeds on closeness and reassurance. But once someone learns to meet their own emotional needs, they no longer depend on that dynamic to feel safe. They stop chasing. They stop people pleasing. They start to recognize their own value, and that creates a different kind of energy, one that is calm, centered, and deeply attractive. It's not performative. It's not cold. It's rooted in a quiet confidence that says, I know what I bring to the table, and I no longer need to beg someone to see it. For the avoidant, this new energy is disorienting. They were used to being pursued, to having emotional space created for them even when they weren't showing up. They were used to the anxious partner accommodating their withdrawal, softening their own needs, tiptoeing around their discomfort. But now the roles are reversed. The anxious partner isn't reaching out. They're not waiting. They're moving forward. And that disruption can trigger a new wave of realization in the avoidant. Avoidants often don't recognize what they had until it's no longer readily available. They misinterpret anxiety for control or desperation while the relationship is active. But once the anxious partner grows into self-security, the love they once offered becomes clearer. It wasn't about control at all. It was about presence, consistency, care. And those qualities become even more when the person who once overfunctioned steps back and reclaims their power. That self-security is magnetic, not because it plays games, but because it radiates something the avoidant never quite felt safe around in emotional maturity without demand. Suddenly, the avoidant is left with a memory of someone who loved them deeply, who once waited, hoped, reached, and who now, with grace, has let go. That creates a void they weren't expecting. And it's not just the person they miss, it's the way they felt around someone who was emotionally available, even when they couldn't reciprocate, just get a reply. What the avoidant often ends up missing isn't the dynamic of control, attention, or even the predictability of the anxious partner's responses. It's the love they couldn't fully receive when it was right in front of them. During the relationship, avoidants may feel overwhelmed by the emotional intensity the anxious partner brings. They interpret that intensity as pressure, assuming the love is conditional or that it will require them to sacrifice their independence. What they don't realize in the moment is that the love being offered is, more often than not, the very thing they deeply desire but don't know how to accept. When avoidants reject an anxious partner, it's rarely because they don't feel something. It's because what they feel is too much to handle. Real love, especially from someone emotionally attuned and invested, brings up every unhealed wound, every fear of vulnerability, every belief they carry that tells them they're safer alone. So they retreat. They protect themselves by cutting ties or creating distance, not recognizing that in doing so, they're pushing away the very experience they crave, genuine connection. Time and distance often bring clarity. Once the anxious partner has stopped reaching out and the emotional noise fades, the avoidant is left to sit with their thoughts. They remember the love, the consistency, the way they were supported without needing to ask. And slowly, they begin to realize that what they pushed away wasn't a threat. It was a rare form of emotional presence, a presence they couldn't handle at the time. Not because it was wrong, but because they weren't ready. Avoidants often miss this love because it asked for nothing but to be shared. It wasn't transactional. It wasn't manipulative. It was open, generous, and deeply human. And when that's gone, when the anxious partner finally reclaims their power and stops pouring into someone who can't receive, it leaves a silence the avoidant can't easily fill. What they miss is the safety they didn't know how to trust, the feeling of being emotionally seen and still accepted. That kind of love doesn't just disappear from memory. It lingers, and while the avoidant may try to move on, date others, or convince themselves they made the right choice, there will always be moments when that loss hits differently, because they didn't just lose a person, they lost an opportunity to experience real intimacy. And by the time they realize it, that love may no longer be available. And so, if you've ever been the one who gave everything, who showed up with your heart open, only to be pushed away, know this, you were never too much. You were simply more than they were ready to receive. What avoidants miss isn't just your presence, it's the depth, the stability, the emotional generosity you offered without conditions. They didn't walk away because you lacked value. They walked away because they lacked the tools to hold what you gave. And while they may circle back, haunted by the memory of the love they once feared, you are no longer where they left you, because real healing isn't about waiting for someone to recognize your worth. It's about rising into it yourself. So keep growing, keep softening without shrinking. Love didn't fail you. You just offered it to someone who couldn't meet it. But someone will. Someone who doesn't pull away when it gets deep. Someone who leans in with you. Thank you for being here and for listening, and for honoring your heart through this process. You are not forgotten. You are not replaceable. You are the rare kind of soul that lingers, not because of how loudly you loved, but because of how deeply you did. Take care of yourself, and remember, the right person won't run from the love you're ready to give. Until next time, thank you, and keep choosing you.